Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. At Western University, we begin most of our events with acknowledging the land in which we're located on as Indigenous territory. So I'd like to begin by introducing myself. My name is Donna Katsopoulos, and I'm the very proud Dean of the Faculty of Education at Western, and welcome to Homecoming 2022. We are so delighted to have you here at our opening event. As educators, we see and accept our responsibility to teach and lead with reconciliation at the forefront of our thinking, and this is very much the commitment of our university. So we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Songbird Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. The meaning of dish with one spoon, I always like to share, really resonates with me. It means that we're eating from one dish and one spoon, and it's a reminder to us of our collective responsibility to each other and to have care and respect for the land that was shared with us by Indigenous people. It also really resonates with me personally because of my own culture. I come from a very remote village in northern Greece, and we often eat around one tipsia with one spoon and with our hands. And it is also in our culture, my own culture, a reminder of our care and responsibility for each other. So again, welcome to this evening's panel discussion, thinking about the future of education in the next 20 years. Our Faculty of Education researchers have been invited this evening to bring their area of expertise to consider how education will change over the next 20 years. What's different now than 20 years ago, what's driving the change, and how we're going to equip our students and teachers to be ready for the classrooms of the future. In fact, we've had an unprecedented period in our history, one that I don't know that we will ever repeat, and maybe we hope not. With the things that we've experienced with COVID. Our mission at the Faculty of Education is to transform education, transform lives. And if you haven't had a chance to visit our website in some time, I would encourage you to look at our new strategic plan and look at the ways that we're thinking about transforming the lives of children, families, communities through our teaching, our research, and our service and our connections to the community. We are preparing at the Faculty of Education for our 50th anniversary in 24-25. And so it's also a good opportunity for us to think about your stories and our stories and how they intersect over the last 50 years, but also thinking about the future. Something you may hear from us in the very near future is an invitation to share your story about how you've transformed education and transformed lives. We're looking to build a compilation of your stories to help shape the kind of celebrations that we're going to be having in 2024, 2025. So stay tuned for some exciting news there. The pandemic certainly has brought forward great change, and perhaps more so than at any point in my career, we're seeing a great opportunity to reflect about how things have changed and what are the things that we'd like to keep the same. And certainly we're asking those questions at the University of Western Ontario, but we're asking them in every school, every classroom, every teacher, and in every aspect of the kind of research questions we're asking. So what I'd like to do before I introduce my esteemed colleagues who are joining us here tonight to do the talks is I'd like to begin with a short video, and I'd like to end with a short video. How we're going to work this evening is we've set the stage that we're thinking about the future of education. And sometimes for those of us in education, we wonder whether things have really changed over the period of time where we've been engaged and how much they've changed. And so I'm going to start with this video from 1992 from one of the individuals who's on this call, who's attending this webinar this evening, Dr. Gene Hewitt. It was really fascinating to see a video that she shared with us from 1992 and to reflect on what she was saying in 1992 and how it relates to what we're experiencing today and how it will relate to the kind of things you're going to hear our researchers talk about. And so Dr. Gene Hewitt is passionate about her belief in the Canadian public school system. She immigrated to Canada from England as a young teacher in 1961. Her 60-year career in education is somewhat unique, and she taught in everything from primary to postgraduate and was a school board administrator and held 2 important portfolios with the Ministry of Education. And she's also been a consultant and a workshop leader in a number of provinces, as well as the US and the United Kingdom. So I'm going to begin with this short clip to set the stage, and then I will introduce each of our speakers, who will have about 15 minutes to speak. We will come back together at the end, where we will have an opportunity to ask each other questions, but also to see a small snip of the conclusion of the video that Dr. Hewitt has so generously shared with us. So I'm just going to play the first clip, and after that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kathy Hibbert, who will open the discussions. Dr. Kathy Hibbert is our Associate Dean of Teacher Education, a classroom teacher, and so she'll begin shortly after this clip. So if you'll just stop here to bring the clip up.
About learning and schooling which are rooted in the industrial era. School systems are best organized in a bureaucratic structure. Government should control education systems. Schools have a monopoly on learning. Attending school is the only way to get an education. Although learning is an individual process, it is best achieved by teaching students in groups. Knowledge should be broken down into curriculum subjects. The longer young people stay in school, the better for them. Yet many such assumptions need to be re-examined in the context of the new, high-technology, information-rich society in which we now live. The quote I just read is from Learning for the Future, from the Corporate Higher Education Forum.
Before I pass this over to Dr. Hibbert, again, I want to thank Dr. Hewitt for sharing this with us. I'm going to return to another clip from her video at the very end after we hear from our researchers. But at this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kathy Hibbert. And thank you, Dr. Hibbert, for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Donna, for hosting, and welcome to all of the rest of you. I'm really happy that you've joined us for this event. It's always interesting to think about how to plan for a future in education that we cannot yet imagine. I'm going to begin also sharing my screen, and I've just got one slide I'm going to put up that I want you to take a look at and think about. It's, someone else imagining in our past what the future of education might look like when they thought that literally all that would be required is that we would be dumping content into some kind of a machine that would be able to transfer right into our brains. And in many ways, it seems to reflect what we saw in the version Web 0.1, where it was very much a transfer of knowledge and content consumption. 20 years ago, the evolution of education in Ontario was shaped really heavily by a new interest in global competitiveness. We saw an increase in standardized international tests like PISA that were influenced by economic prospects for employability skills through the OECD. We were influenced by market recognition that education was now seen as largely an untapped market during what was becoming known as the information age. And certainly we were influenced by technology. And when we think about how this has combined together, we notice that in the last 20 years, our curriculum has become more and more narrowly defined, scrutinized, audited. We see a rise in private for-profit solutions to what were considered public policy problems. You saw the tutoring company services, test preparation, online learning options showing up in cities and towns around the country. We also saw government seeking to create tighter controls around teacher professional development, which translated into force-fed training on whatever government initiatives were deemed important in the day. And those were provided through Train the Trainer or by publishing companies in the use of their products. So anyone who wanted to take a more thoughtful, critical dive into their professional practice had to do so outside of the system, sadly. The context for imagining what the future of education will look like over the next 20 years has to be situated in the reality of what today's learners are living. So let's think about the reality of young people today. As Donna mentioned, we're in a global pandemic, a climate crisis. We have multiple wars, genocides, housing shortage or a lack of affordability, student debt, inflation, severe mental health crisis, all together create a fairly bleak environment. But at the same time, we see engagement through a rise in social justice responsibility. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and other movements have been dominating the news, as have reactions to those movements. White extremism, a growing number of far-right leaders being elected, renewed fear of nuclear war and terrorism, a disdain for expertise and science in favor of alternative facts that align with different beliefs. We also see the rise of developing countries aided by technology and the recognition that perhaps we have outsourced too much. We see the power of new knowledge that we're gathering about the universe. Just think of all the pictures that we're seeing from the new telescope. We've seen the loss of dependable truths, the healthcare crisis, sports and recreation that have become financially inaccessible to many families. We notice that Generation Z or Z, those born roughly between 1995 and 2010, have been watching their parents. They've watched their parents dedicate untold hours to work, and they've rejected that lifestyle. Generation Z is unlikely to stay in the same job or spend all of their time working in a particular job, but they're also the generation that is known for having a side hustle to make ends meet. They crave autonomy, flexibility, and independence, while at the same time often being thwarted in their efforts to achieve the standard of living that their parents achieved. I find Generation Z a really interesting case in light of the trends that we see globally. I've been reading a book by David Epstein called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And in his book, he recounts recent attention that's been paid to learning how to be specialists or experts in all kinds of areas. And he noted that all kinds of experts will argue that anyone who wants to develop a skill, play an instrument, or lead their field should start early, focus intensely, and rack up as many hours of deliberate practice as possible. If you dabble or delay, you'll never catch up to the people who got a head start. We've all heard about the 10,000 hours it takes to become a master, and he mentions Tiger Woods as a prime example. But he takes a closer look at the research on the world's top performers, from professional athletes to Nobel laureates, that show that actually early specialization is the exception, not the rule. In his work, looking at the most successful athletes, artists, musicians, inventors, forecasters, and scientists, he discovered that in most fields, especially those that are complex and unpredictable, perhaps like the one we're living in now, generalists, not specialists, are primed to excel. Generalists often find their path late, juggle many interests rather than focusing on one. They're more creative, more agile, and able to make more connections that their specialized peers can't see. education is really about the development of the human potential. Hyper-specialization doesn't always help us out in complex situations. For example, when I became involved with the first medical responders to the Fukushima nuclear accident, we noticed that hyper-specialized experts in the field of radiation safety and nuclear science were not equipped to serve in the capacity of public communicators during a crisis. The training had been so focused that when the crisis hit and they were required to act together, they were unable to do so. Leadership failed, communication failed, and mental health issues skyrocketed. In fact, mental health became the #1 issue in that accident, not radiation exposure. So what are we going to need over the next 20 years? Are folks who are adaptable, flexible, collaborative, and willing to entertain ideas that fall outside of their own expertise. The OECD, an organization that has heavily influenced the direction of education over the last 20 years, has identified 3 challenges that we're going to really need to address in the next 2 decades. The first challenge is environmental. Climate change and the depletion of natural resources requires urgent action and adaptation. We can't afford to wait. The second challenge is economic. But scientific knowledge is creating new opportunities and solutions that can enrich our lives, while at the same time fueling disruptive waves of change in every sector. Financial interdependence at a local, national, and regional level has also created global value chains and a shared economy, but also pervasive uncertainty and exposure to economic risk and crises. Data is being created, used, and shared on a vast scale, holding out the promise of expansion, growth, and improved efficiency, while posing new problems of cybersecurity and privacy protection. So I think you can see that we have wonderful opportunities, but they're coming with great challenges as well. A third challenge is social. As the global population continues to grow, migration, urbanization, and increasingly social and cultural diversity are reshaping our communities, our countries, and in large parts of the world, inequalities in living standards and life chances are widening, while conflict, instability, and inertia, often intertwined with populist politics, are eroding the trust and confidence in government itself. The threats of war and terrorism, as we are witnessing, are escalating. The 21st century has increasingly been defined in terms of well-being, but we are really coming to learn that well-being means a lot more than just access to material resources, such as income and wealth, jobs and earnings, or housing. It's also related to quality of life, including health, civic engagement, social connections, education, security, life satisfaction, and the environment. Equitable access to all of these underpins the concept of inclusive growth. So future-ready students are going to need to exercise agency in their own education and throughout life. Agency implies a sense of responsibility to participate in the world, and in so doing, to influence people, events, and circumstances for the better. Teachers should also be empowered to use their professional knowledge, skills, and expertise in their development of curriculum and in the teaching of the students that are before them. UNESCO argues that education is critical for the knowledge economy. Education builds human capital. It increases individuals' capabilities, enhancing those economic productivity concerns and facilitating the development and adoption of what people think of as frontier technologies. When we think about all of these things together, we also have to imagine that evaluation and assessment tools are going to need to align with these objectives, which is currently not often the case. The preeminence of individual testing vis-a-vis collaborative learning or testing based on information recall within schools that are increasingly digitized are good examples of this dissonance. 21st century assessments are going to need to look into students' integrated knowledge, their skills and attitudes with applied tasks, their ability to respond effectively to the increasing need of capturing processes that manifest validly in multiple ways, such as creativity. Around the world, central governments still responsible for the outcomes of schooling systems have adapted to new roles, moving away from central planning and control and strengthening accountability and support in relation to local actors. Ontario's education system has yet to move to that model, but we're striving to compete on international testing metrics with countries like Finland, who embrace teachers as autonomous, accountable professionals. We know that students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to struggle at school, have lower participation rates in early childhood education and care, and lower expectations of and actual enrollment in tertiary education. Canada has recently taken a huge step in terms of providing a national childcare subsidy. Time will tell if this initiative will begin to redress some of the inequities faced by disadvantaged youth. But if we combine that with the efforts that we're making right now to look at the whole child as we plan learning in a safe, inclusive, and more equitable classroom, we expect to see students thrive in our schools. Decolonization, flexibility, and inclusivity as a means to provide more equitable learning will require deep systemic change. We have to be ready and willing to take these steps if we are, as a nation, hoping to prepare our children for a future that readies all to participate fully in their civic lives in ways that lead to living more meaningfully and productively, where meaning and productivity are more than just skills for work. I think you're muted, Donna.
Oh gosh, you'd think after all this time. My apologies. Thank you, Dr. Hibbert. You've raised a number of interesting thoughts, and I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have a Q&A feature, and as the questions come up, please do post them, and we'll return to the questions at the end of all 4 of our presentations. So you'll look down and you should see a Q&A box that if you link on it, you'll be able to type in your question. So the next speaker is Dr. Margaret Lingel. She's an assistant professor of counseling psychology. We were thrilled to have her join us last year. And her talk is going to be on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on counseling with low-income clients. This is an important aspect of thinking about how we're recovering from this pandemic. And of course, our mental and social health well-being is a key factor. So thank you very much, Marguerite. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Donna. I'm just going to take a millisecond to share my screen, and hopefully that'll go smoothly. Okay, is that nice and clear for everybody? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So excited to be here, sharing space and time with both the fellow panelists and all of you, and happy homecoming. I'm excited to speak to you about the future of research and education, at least from my perspective, and to share a little bit about a particular project that my colleagues and I will be starting this year that we're pretty excited about. A little bit of context. Our counseling psychology program has been and continues to be committed to a social justice paradigm. And so this entails a shift away from an individualistic focus on traditional psychological theory, education, and practice, and shifting or moving towards acknowledging and being responsive to the sociocultural context of clients' lives. These contexts, of course, they involve broader systems that impact their health and well-being, the health and well-being of our clients. And these systems have been undeniably impacted, not only by the pandemic, but by a socio-political landscape that is harsh and disconcerting. Our program specifically trains pre-service counselors to go directly into the field of counseling in a variety of different community settings. And as a program and individually as psychologists and educators, we aspire to both recognize and understand both historical and contemporary experiences with power, privilege, and oppression. And we seek to address the institutional barriers and related inequities. What we are seeing with the pandemic that has already been mentioned by other folks is that deeply rooted injustices across lines of race and class and income have been exacerbated by this pandemic, by the global pandemic, which is now throwing into sharp relief the adverse impact of systemic racism and classism on basic human rights, such as access to healthcare and job, food, and housing security. Simultaneously, it's, I think, important to note that Canada is being confronted with its very own, very real and very embedded systemic racism across public service sectors, as well as treaty rights violations from coast to coast. And in this context, we have an ethical responsibility to engage in responding both in our teaching and in our research. So in this way, I think that the path forward must be informed by all of these realities. When we think of research in education as a reflection of our changing world, I think we must consider where we've been and where we hope to go. And I think there are a couple of realities that are important to contextualize our work, especially when it comes to research in particular. We know that research has historically been and still is a manifestation of extant systems of privilege and oppression. Just like all of our broader structures, education and the academy are embedded in inequities in access for minoritized folks. And to respond to this, we must recognize that holding space for the voices that have been absent historically from research and education becomes paramount in the work that we do. Research needs to be able to give special priority to the dialogue and interaction with minoritized individuals, educators, and researchers above extant research that is void of these non-dominant identity voices. Research also requires a process of dialogue and collective engagement. So I've had the privilege and honor of doing research throughout my service provision as my work as a counseling psychologist. And before entering the faculty very recently, I worked as a psychologist in our school boards and in our school systems. And I believe that there is increased space and need for participatory research. And that participants and researchers can co-construct bodies of knowledge. In this way, our participants of research become the drivers of the research itself, collaborating and creating alongside researchers. So with that said, I'm really excited to share a little bit about the research that my colleagues and I are going to be starting in the coming weeks, I guess. We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected and continues to affect members of disadvantaged groups. We know that economic insecurity is a growing problem. We know that with that insecurity comes psychological effects that have also been exacerbated by the pandemic. We know that individuals with low income may experience high financial distress levels, which contribute to an increased frequency of mental health challenges. These are all things that we know. On top of this, we know that access to public sector services and affordable services, including those in counseling, have also been impacted by the pandemic. So In other words, people are needing services more than ever, but they're getting access to less. And I've seen this firsthand in our schools with our students and families. When it comes to counseling in particular, our field is aware that the aftermath of COVID-19 will, of course, present challenges and perhaps opportunities that we need to pay attention to. Counselors are going to have to reconsider their existing frameworks and approaches in the context of increasing social inequities, as well as considering socioeconomic disadvantage. And I'm excited and grateful to be talking with you today about some research that feels close to these issues. This research that I think is directly related to these needs as well. And so my colleagues, Dr. Jason Brown, who is also in the counseling psychology program, and my colleague, Dr. Melissa J. over at Athabasca, the three of us have been fortunate enough to receive funding to be involved in a 4-year study that will be examining helpful aspects of counseling from the perspectives of counselors and clients living with low income. This is a tiered project. It's going to involve both quantitative and qualitative elements as we really begin to focus on the voices of clients and families with low income. The study's been also endorsed by the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. So this will allow for access to counselors and clients nationally, which is quite exciting. In our first year, we're going to be starting off with surveying a national sample of counselors about their perspectives of the impact on COVID-19 on the pandemic on accessibility to counseling services. This will give us a sense of the national trends of what counselors are seeing in their practice and what they're seeing with the communities that they're currently working with. In year 2, we will conduct in-depth interviews with 90 counselors and 90 low-income clients. And this is where we will dig deeper into both the strengths and needs of our participants, hearing the voices directly from low-income folks attempting to access services or currently accessing counseling services. In year 3, we will compare clients and counselors' perspectives on helpful practices. So this is where we can look at service provision and how it may be or may not be meeting the needs of folks accessing those services. And then those results will form the basis of survey questions to be administered to 900 counselors in year 4 to, again, look at those national trends and how things are evolving. Our hope with this work, with this project, is that our results will identify the impacts of COVID-19 on the pandemic, on access to counseling. I think our results will also shed light on what counselors are identifying as helpful aspects of counseling when it comes to working with low-income clients and their families. It will also allow us to understand what low-income clients identify as being helpful aspects in counseling. And I'm really intrigued to see both the similarities and differences there between what clients are identifying as their needs and strengths versus what counselors are feeling is helpful in the work that they do. And finally, we'll be looking at which helpful aspects of counseling from clients' perspectives specifically are associated with counselors' social locations, as well as cultural and intersectional awareness. For me, I think the heart of the counseling psychology program and the heart of work like this particular project involves research that directly informs practice. Our participants in this project are actively working counselors and folks trying to access or currently accessing counseling services that may or may not be meeting their needs. And our goal is to have our findings directly inform how we can begin to meet more of those needs, specifically when it comes to working with low-income clients and families. Of course, our results will contribute to the counseling literature on diversity, reflective practice, counselor competencies, and practice approaches when working with clients that are facing significant barriers. But the results will also highlight the needs of clients living with low income from their own perspectives, in their words and in their voices. Our collaboration with CCPA, the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, will also help with the dissemination of the results within the association. So the results will be going right back to practitioners to inform the work that they do. Community organizations can also use the findings to support proposals that create, enhance, and evaluate counseling services for individuals living with low income. And finally, educators like ourselves will use the findings to increase students' personal and social awareness of low income and ways to be responsive as practitioners when they go into the field. For me, this is key for how we continue to change our training programs to meet the needs of community. I think that research like this digs deep into accessing voices that need to be heard to be able to appropriately respond to practice needs. And for me, I believe that research like this is one of the keys to unlocking a brighter future for our field in the coming 20 years. So I'm excited and thank you for sharing space and time. And I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's see if I can stop share.
I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Danielle Syrac, who is also joined us last year, and we're delighted to have her as an assistant professor in arts education. And so Danielle's going to be talking to us today about why play, and perhaps why play even more than ever, given the period that we've emerged from. So thank you, Dr. Syrac. I'll pass it over to you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. And thank you for the invitation. It's such a joy to be able to be here with you all on this panel and to think about education as it is, education the next 20 years, and continue to think about play. So what is play, and why is it important for education in the next 20 years? Play, as Henriksen says, is something we do just for the fun of it. Simply put, play is using knowledge, body, mind, and abilities for the pure enjoyment of using them. When imaginative or innovative people play with things or concepts or processes, they may open doors to new ways of thinking via unexpected breakthroughs. Creative people in different disciplines all speak to the value of play. They play with distinctions, boundaries, unassailable truths, and the limits of the system. Through this play, they transform ideas into creative acts or new knowledge. Play is hardwired into us, and to play is to be creative. Scholar Daniel Ansari has written that play is a refuge from ordinary life, a sanctuary of the mind, where one is exempt from life's customs, methods, and decrees. It can take place anywhere.
Danielle, I'm sorry to pause you, but are you by any chance covering your microphone? You're going in and out.
Oh no.
Or maybe if you could just
I'm
sit a little.
not, but
There you go. That's a little bit better.
Help? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thanks for letting me know. Play is hardwired into us, and to play is to be creative. Scholar Diane Ackerman has written that play is a refuge from ordinary life, a sanctuary of the mind where one is exempt from life's customs, methods, and decrees. It can take place anywhere: the playground, a field, the stage, sports stadium, even, she says, the classroom. Wherever the place, it is clearly set off from the rest of reality. Timing may be flexible or exact, but whatever the time and wherever the place, she affirms that shenanigans are allowed, strategies can be tried, and selves can be revised. To play is to risk, and to risk is to play. It is to be the best version of yourself. Most animals play: courtship games to prepare for finding a mate, socializing games to practice cooperation and establish rank, motor skills games, war games, and life-saving games, which include things like pouncing and mock fighting. The more an animal needs to learn in order to survive, the more it needs to play. The more leisure time it has, the more it can play. Play helps to keep the senses informed and alert. Simple play, like the play that I've just described, can take many forms and have many purposes. But when play starts focusing one's life and offering ecstatic moments, Ackerman believes that we fall into something called deep play. This special caliber of play, she says, makes thrill-seeking understandable and creativity possible. Deep play awakens the most creative, sentient, and joyful aspects of our inner selves. And more than anything else, our passion for deep play has made us the puzzling and resplendent beings we are. Deep play is rapture, ecstasy. It is transcendent. It happens in that moment in which we are totally aware and yet lose sense of all time and space. Nothing can go wrong, and we experience life in its depth and fullness. I am a musician educator, and although I teach in a faculty of education, my creative practice, and indeed play, is foundational to my sense of self and my scholarship. On March 12th, 2020, I was sitting in a university office working on a research paper with a colleague when the first announcement of mandatory lockdown popped up on my computer screen. Schools currently shut down for spring break would not reopen for at least 2 weeks due to COVID-19. Over the following days and weeks, in response to a cascade of public health directives, educational and cultural organizations went into various forms of lockdown. Schools closed and classes went online. Performance and art venues went dark. The hiatus of in-person play created a profound lack for artists and arts educators, not just an absence, but a loss of our embodied and enacted sense of self and community. It was a loss that each of us, though differently, grieved. For that first year of the pandemic, a colleague and dear friend, Dr. Terry Sefton, and I engaged in duo ethnographic writing to make sense of what was happening to us as musicians and as educators. Over the course of the year, we wrote back and forth, we texted, we called, we shared our music with one another from the isolation of our homes. This writing process became a stable place amidst all of the uncertainty, a place where we could play with words, play with theory, play with ideas, play with music, and provide a space for reflection. We took solace in the knowledge that, not this minute, maybe not tomorrow, but in the near future, a caring eye would read and listen and think about what we had created, and in their response, bring a different lens to what we were going through in the time of pandemic. In one of my duo ethnographic entries, I wrote the following. This morning, I reflected upon the juxtaposition that I perceive between efficiency or productivity and Ackerman's theory of deep play. To fall deeply into something, to be intensely and profoundly immersed, is not possible when one is concerned with just getting the job done as quickly as possible. Play isn't just important for children, nor for the creative exploration of adults. It's important for humanity. As Ackerman reminds us, we evolved through play. Our culture thrives on play. Ideas are playful reverberations of the mind. And to me, this is why play is so important when I consider education in the next 20 years. Elliott Eisner, a former professor of art and education at Stanford University, and one of the most respected educational researchers and writers of our time, argues that the arts have traditionally been viewed as a fallback position at best. Something, he says, you retreat to when there is no science to provide guidance. He continues, we live in a time that puts a premium on the measurement of outcomes, on the ability to predict them, and on the need to be absolutely clear about what we want to accomplish. To aspire for less is to court professional irresponsibility. And he's right. The creative arts, and by this I mean broadly dance, drama, music, and visual arts, are messy, chaotic, and often unpredictable. They don't bode well in educational systems that are predicated on standardization or accountability frameworks or efficiency or productivity, and are often the first to go when teachers feel pressure to raise test scores or when so-called classroom management is difficult. Eisner advocates for a different conceptualization of education in a very fundamental sort of way, articulating that the different ways of thinking and experiencing and playing that the arts can evoke benefits students and teachers in profound ways. He argues that children's minds are developed in and through the opportunities they have, and that the arts afford them agency to become architects of their own development so that they can assume responsibility of what they want to become. Teaching and learning in the arts is primarily experiential, and material practices are essential to the process. Students are engaged in embodied learning and hands-on practices, pedagogies of listening, seeing, and feeling that are located in specificities of identity and place. These ways of listening, seeing, and feeling are ways of knowing the world and understanding the world in which we live. And to embrace these creative pedagogies and to embrace play can transform the culture of education. I will end off in the spirit of Ackerman by asking you all a question as we begin the fall. What risks will you take this year? What play will you take part in? Go, risk, play. This is how we can be the best versions of ourselves, and it is this creative spirit that can drive education the next 20 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Syrac. It's interesting thinking about play, and even as adults thinking about our engagement in play. So you've raised a lot of interesting thoughts. It's really my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for tonight, Dr. Daniel Ansari, who's a professor and Canada Research Chair in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience and Learning in the Department of Psychology, and very fortunate for us to have him jointly appointed to the Faculty of Education. And he's going to be talking about numbers, brain development, and education. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us tonight, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks very much, Donna. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all tonight, and to have the opportunity as well to listen to the fellow panelists, which has been really engaging and fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about the next 20 years in education from the vantage point of my research program, but then also talk about some broader future directions. So my research is really concerned with better understanding how children learn fundamental numerical and mathematical skills, and also to better understand why some children struggle with math and how we can apply research to inform education and to inform how we might help struggling learners in math. So whenever I talk about math, I like to remind the audience just how much we use numbers in our everyday lives. So when we wake up in the morning, one of the first pieces of information we orient to perhaps is our phones these days, but some of us still have old-fashioned alarm clocks. And so we immediately process numerical information even without thinking about it. We process numerical information when we look at the newspaper, when we listen to the radio, and we might check how the stock market is doing. When we travel, we need numerical information to inform our decisions and to guide our actions. And we all know that terrible things happen when we get numerical information wrong, when we do mistakes with numbers that can have devastating consequences. And indeed, we know from a very long line of literature that numerical skills are really critical. We know, for example, that low numeracy is associated with adverse outcomes such as, such as unemployment, physical illness, depression, and even incarceration. These are, of course, not causal relationships, but nevertheless, there is a correlation between low numeracy and these types of outcomes. And we know from, for example, the OECD PISA study that Dr. Hibbert mentioned in her presentation, that improvements in mathematical competence within a country over time are related to economic growth. And beyond sort of economic outcomes, we also know that numeracy plays a really important role in healthcare. So we really witnessed this over the past 2.5 years, where we were all bombarded with numerical information and numerical concepts such as exponential growth and flattening the curve. And there is indeed a long line of research in a field called health numeracy, where it's been suggested that the ability of patients and healthcare professionals to use numerical healthcare information affects their care and affects the health of patients. You can just imagine a nurse in a busy emergency room on a Friday afternoon, trying to remember a reading of an instrument, let's say a blood pressure monitor, and translate that into an action. And this all requires being able to process numbers, being able to hold them in mind, and so forth. So we know that numbers are really important, and therefore they play a critical role in early childhood education. Yet when it comes to research on how children learn early math, we're still lagging behind the tremendous progress that has been made in the domain of reading. We now have a really good understanding of how children learn to read, what are some of the fundamental skills and concepts that need to be in place in order to enable young children to become proficient readers. When it comes to numbers, we're still scratching at the surface, but much progress is being made in the domain of early numeracy as well, and research is starting to be translated into the classroom. And I want to give you some examples here. What we borrow quite heavily in the field of early math, the science of early math, if you want, is from reading, is our focus on foundational competencies, really trying to understand what are some of the key building blocks that allow children to get their numerical and mathematical abilities off the ground. And this is because we know, again, from research and reading, that when children don't have good foundational skills in the early years, they continue to lag behind their peers who have solid foundational skills, who undergo a trajectory of growth. So this then means that if we can identify foundational skills, we can perhaps find ways of fostering those foundational skills and ensuring that all learners undergo trajectories of growth when it comes to their achievement in numeracy and mathematics. So what are some of the foundational competencies underlying math? Well, over the last 20 years or so, much research has focused on how we process numbers without reference to symbols, how we, for example, look at this display of dots and can quickly compare it to another display of dots, or quickly estimate how many dots are in this display. And research has shown that even very young babies seem to be sensitive to quantities, so they can discriminate between arrays of dots, suggesting that perhaps we are born with some kind of sensitivity to quantities that we can then use to scaffold higher level numerical and mathematical skills. Indeed, cross-species research suggests that non-human primates are also capable of discriminating between dot arrays, something that we sometimes refer to as non-symbolic numerical quantities. And neuroscience research has also demonstrated that areas in the brain are sensitive to quantities and the discrimination and estimation of quantities, chiefly in an area called the intraparietal sulcus, which is shown here. It's kind of a bird's eye view of the brain. In the posterior regions of your brain, it's the intraparietal sulcus, which seems to be highly sensitive to numerical quantities, even before children learn numerical symbols such as Arabic numerals. However, of course, in contrast to other species, we humans over the course of cultural history have constructed symbolic representations of number. We're not born with any sensitivity to number symbols. We learn them through education, through informal interactions with peers, with parents, through playing games. And it's for those of you who have young children or had young children or who interacted with young children, you will know that it takes children a lot of time to learn numerical symbols and to be able to manipulate them fluently and to use them in their everyday lives. So some of the questions that we are pursuing in the lab is how do these different systems relate to one another? On the one hand, we've got this innate non-symbolic system for quantity discrimination, but then we need to develop a symbolic, more cultural system for the representation of number. And finally, we need to use that cultural system for the representation of number to do things such as mental arithmetic. So we try to understand how these systems relate to one another, and also how the system we're born with relates to the cultural system, or whether the cultural system indeed changes the innate system for quantity representations, or whether they're fully related to one another. I don't want to sort of go through all of the details, and neither do I have the time, but just to give you some highlights of things we've discovered over the past few years. We've discovered that it's symbolic number processing that really counts for arithmetic learning. So it is not as though we're born with a propensity to learn arithmetic, but we have to acquire that through interactions, through education. And we've also learned that rather than the non-symbolic innate system constraining the acquisition of the symbolic system, it's when we learn number symbols that changes the way we view quantities in the world around us. So one of the things in my lab that we're very keen on doing is translating research to education. And I just want to share one example with you, which is a screener that we've designed quite a few years ago now, but we made this screener available online for free. And you can go to this website, numeracyscreener.org, and download it. And it's a very simple paper and pencil test where children are asked to cross out the larger of two dot arrays, the numerically larger of two dot arrays, or the numerically larger of two symbols. And this test is really designed to test their basic intuitions around quantities, their ability to relate quantities to one another, and to do so both in a non-symbolic format and in symbolic format. And using this screener, we've done a lot of different research that has expanded from just designing a screener that can be used to identify children who might be at risk of developing mathematical learning difficulties, to research that really integrates the perspectives of educators with the perspectives of researchers. So we work with local school boards and have used the information we have gained from teachers about how effective they find this tool or how ineffective they find this tool to improve it and to think about future iterations of this measurement. Because it's a paper and pencil test and because it's freely available, we've also been able with collaborators across the world to use this measure to gain a better understanding of children's intuitions around numbers and their knowledge of symbolic numbers in many different contexts across the globe. Indeed, we now have data from 6 continents, 13 countries, 16 regions, and 18 independent data sets. So we can now start to develop a global perspective on early numeracy development and try to understand differences between different regions of the world and also what predicts math success in different jurisdictions, because so much of the research to date is focused on high-income countries, and there's a much need to better understand human development across multiple different contexts and to both understand similarities as well as differences. One of the things that's also really important and that we focus on and that I think should be a great focus of educational research over the next 20 years is to pay attention to emotional factors and to understand how emotion and cognition interact in learning. And here, just one example is math anxiety. Math anxiety is very common. It's this feeling of apprehension and fear when doing math. And it leads to students avoiding math. It's poorly understood to this day, and evidence-based interventions are necessary. But one of the most important points about math anxiety is that math anxiety does not equal poor math. Lots of studies show that the students who are actually very capable of learning math are experiencing high levels of math anxiety. And it's important for us to pay attention to the two different sides of the coin, the cognitive side of learning, but also the emotional side of learning. So in terms of key future challenges over the next 20 years, just trying to go back one slide, in my view, we need to do much more to identify learning difficulties early on. through screening, through evidence-based screening that directly informs early instruction as well and helps educators to differentiate the instruction. We tend to think about learning difficulties such as dyslexia and dyscalculia in categories, but actually they overlap, and children often experience multiple learning challenges at the same time. We need to understand why that is and move towards a more dimensional view of learning difficulties rather than a categorical one. I also think there's a great need to better understand the interventions that are carried out in school at multiple levels, at the behavioral level, but also at the neuronal level, in order to understand the mechanisms that drive change in children's learning so that we can use that process to iteratively improve our interventions. And as I've already alluded to, and my fellow panelists have also alluded to, it's so necessary for us to focus on diverse populations of learners, both here in Canada as well as internationally, and to ensure that our research is truly representative, which is challenging, but it is something that we absolutely have to do. As was already mentioned in multiple presentations, the COVID-19 pandemic brought so many changes. And one of the changes that it brought is that technology started to play a much greater role in our lives and also started to play a much greater role in students' lives. And there's so much educational technology out there, but the problem with it is that much of it is just an unregulated market. So there's no evidence base that is driving the development of educational tools. That's not to say that there are no evidence-based edtech tools, but there are many tools that are not driven by the latest evidence on how children learn. So what we really need to do is to increase our understanding of the evidence behind edtech and to ensure that educational technology is constrained by what we know about the developing mind, about the developing brain. And as part of this network, Sarah is connecting the EdTech research ecosystem. We're working to improve the evidence base and to work with EdTech developers and other stakeholders to take evidence seriously when designing products and also when evaluating products, and to think more about the evidence base that underpins educational technologies. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the panel discussion. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Daniel. So we're actually making great time, everybody, and I wanted to just remind everybody to enter your questions in the Q&A. But before we do that, I'd like to return to, so we've been thinking about what is the future going to look like in the next 20 years, and had we asked this question perhaps before March 12th, 2020, we would have been perhaps thinking about other things. The kind of things that we're thinking about in the workplace are the kind of things that are informing the things that we're doing in classrooms at the university. Well, we didn't talk a lot about it, but it is a very common discussion amongst educators, post-COVID recovery, not only in children. They've been defining it, some define it as a COVID cliff on the learning loss, the social, emotional, and learning loss that's happened over COVID. And we are also seeing it at the university. Of course, students are starting university in a very different place than they would have because they've spent the last 2 years learning online. So over the last 2 years, just to summarize what what all of our speakers have talked about today, we have seen the importance of socialization, the importance of human connection, how much we've missed connecting and playing our instruments or sharing our music. We've more than ever talked about what is our meaning and purpose in life? Where do we want to be as human beings as we interact with one another? And we heard that very clearly from Dr. Hibbert's talk. And we, of course, recognized more than ever over the pandemic the dire circumstances many members of our community were in and who are low income. While many of us were able to stay at home, we still needed people to be at the cash registers at our grocery stores. We still needed a variety of essential workers who were providing support for us. And these people also had children at home trying to learn. And so this became a very problematic, dire for some. And so we are thinking about it, and back to Daniel's comments about learning and mathematics and numbers. It's very fascinating, Daniel. I hadn't thought of it, but the extent to which we were all using numerical language to talk about COVID and infection rates and probabilities, and the kind of terms we were all using quite naturally every day. But the idea here is, what does this mean for the next 20 years? What are we going to see different in classrooms, in teachers, in communities? What is the challenge going to be for us as educators to think about the kind of things our future selves will need following this extreme period in our history? So before I open it up to some questions, and I see they're coming in, so I would encourage you to do that. And I would also invite any of that. I've made a question. I've been writing down questions as I've been listening to the very engaging talks. I would encourage each of you to think about entering your question into the Q&A. So before we do that, though, I would like to conclude with, I would like to begin the discussion with another clip by Dr. Gene Hewitt. Now, keep in mind, this is sort of where she ended her presentation. Keep in mind, this was 1992. And what I want you to think about as you see this clip is, how much have things changed? Are we really asking questions that are that different? And so I will share my screen so we can see this last clip.
As you talk to colleagues about the ideas I've shared with you, I'm sure you will identify other changes which have occurred during the last 30 years which have implications for schooling and the role of the teacher. For example, there are changes which place the teacher in the role of advocate for young people, as well as facilitator of their learning. When a new paradigm is called for, those most familiar with and attached to the old paradigm tend to ignore or resist what is before them, like the Swiss watchmakers facing the quartz movement. They argue that the new model has no validity, that it's a fad, it cannot be taken seriously. You see, the new paradigm of a teacher does call into question the very basic structures which we have created to deliver the transmission model of learning most effectively. I refer to prescriptive courses of study, rigid timetables, a specific school day, the notion of passing or failing, lockstep grades, and so on. This is a challenge to us as professionals. But if we recognize that the assumptions upon which all these structures were built are no longer true assumptions, then we must embrace a new paradigm, a paradigm which meets the needs of 2000 and beyond. As you talk to colleagues about the ideas I've shared with you,
so I'm really struck how this was 30 years ago, and we could have had this. So thank you, Dr. Hewitt. I know you're out there. It's really fascinating that if I had just had her voice and no images, that we could have changed a word or two, and it would have been exactly what we would have been saying to each other right now, that we've had this shift and the kind of things that we were doing, the set education day in terms of timing, the kind of things she was talking about 30 years ago. Here we are, we're still talking about them, but I think COVID has created a very interesting pressure point for us, an opportunity. Some might say an opportunity. And some might say it's reminded us of what's important that we have to keep from pre-COVID, and we should continue. So with that, I will ask you to think about that and consider entering some questions in the chat, but we do have a couple of questions that I will begin with. So the first one is from Mr. Jack Roach. I thoroughly enjoyed Dr. Hibbert's talk. Much of her talk reflected my thoughts. I have a question regarding the education system as a whole. I worked part-time in post-secondary classrooms while I worked full-time in an industrial production environment. The biggest issues that I noticed with new graduates is the lack of creativity. So this might be for Danielle as well. They seem to believe that one solution fits all, but in most situations, they find that every situation requires a unique and creative solution. How will our education system, and I'll say going forward, adapt to encourage creativity and finding solutions in our many problems in the future?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Jack. I think just to springboard on what Donna was just saying, I do think, I mean, these are questions we've been asking for a long, long time, but the pandemic has sharpened our focus on it. When suddenly we couldn't connect in the same sorts of ways, when suddenly we saw meaningfulness in in-person connection that had maybe just been in the background before. And when we think about the way forward in education, it has to be at the forefront. This idea of connection is important, social is important, and the arts offer not just the arts. There are lots of things that offer these things, but speaking from my background and my expertise in the arts offer us these things in profound kinds of ways. They offer us the ability to connect to one another, and they offer us a means to explore the social and the cultural. And one thing I did want to say is when I offer these ideas, and draw on also the ideas of Diane Ackerman and Elliott Eisner and so on. I don't want to seem glib, like, oh, we just need to play and that'll make it all better. That's of course not the case. There are some very real and important and timely issues that my colleagues have talked about that we need to address in education. But I think it would do us an extreme disservice if we said, no more play. We just have to focus on learning loss. We just have to focus on, on making sure that we get back to where we were. I think that the arts can offer us opportunities to think in different kinds of ways about the social and cultural connections that we have with one another. It offers students an opportunity alongside teachers and community members to engage with activism in things like Black Lives Matter and truth and reconciliation in ways that are meaningful to them. And so for me, when I think about education system adapting to encourage creativity, as Jack has said here, making space for time for those things is at the top of my mind when I'm talking to pre-service teachers and also in my own practice.
Did anybody else want to jump in before I go to the next question? Okay. So we've had an interesting question posted by Dr. Claire Crooks. We're really grateful that she's joining us tonight. Dr. Crooks is our esteemed colleague who's the director for the Center of School Mental Health. And I'm just going to read you her comment. Thank you for the thought-provoking presentations. I'm struck that the many challenges we are facing and the needs described by the speakers cut across traditional disciplinary boundaries. We need to address math learning challenges and math anxiety together. We need to look at the impact of counseling and individual enterprise and understanding social structures. How do we support students and emerging researchers? How do we challenge ourselves to work in ways that extend beyond our boundaries of our individual paradigms and training? It's a big question. Who'd like to jump in and take that one?
I have a couple of thoughts, and they stem from thinking about working in interdisciplinary ways and some of the barriers that currently exist to that. We're starting to see funding organizations, for example, seeking interdisciplinary collaboration as a way to be successful in your funding application. That's more recent. I mean, traditionally, those of us who work in academia know that we are always competing sometimes against each other within the same field, definitely against other fields for the limited amount of funding that we have access to. But I think, you know, when I was talking about the complexity of today's challenges are requiring more than just what one particular discipline has to offer. So I think that, you know, the opportunities and abilities for us to learn from one another and from the deep research and thinking that happens in other disciplines, it helps open all of our minds to what might be possible. For our grad students, as Claire is asking, our grad students and our researchers, I think that we have to model this in the way that we assess and evaluate their progress and their work as well, by inviting them to not only focus on their own particular area, but also to ensure that they go out and beyond. I have a young man from Ukraine who's living with us, and he's joined a robotics club because he's in the engineering program. And he said, you have to participate in an area that you will not get in your coursework in order to belong to the club, right? So it's an opportunity for us to see the world through those different perspectives, which I think we can all say, witnessing what's been going on in the world today would be a healthy change.
I think, Kathy, you raised a really good point. The idea of crossing boundaries and interdisciplinary work, probably more than ever, we're seeing that, I would say over the last 5 years. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily related to coming out of COVID, but I think the demand for that has only been growing and only anticipating to grow. And Dr. Crooks was quite wise in identifying that. We do still create structural barriers, whether we're in schools, whether in higher education, or in the community, of finding easy ways to collaborate and work together and to solve problems, drawing on multiple types of disciplines and multiple types of knowledge. Where I think from COVID that we have something to gain from that is that although many of us are frustrated with Zoom and thinking that we may not want to be doing it as much as we're doing it, it's opened opportunities to talk to people all over the world in places that we couldn't have imagined. And I remember I had a meeting over the summertime, and Daniel was in Germany or the UK, and we had someone in the Netherlands and someone in Singapore, all on one phone call, all on one Zoom call. And so technology certainly COVID has taught us that technology can be our friend when we think about interdisciplinary collaborations. So thank you for the question, Dr. Crooks. The next question that I wanted to raise, that was raised, I'm going to pass over to Dr. Ansari, is that you heard me mention some of the dialogue that we've been talking about in schools and in learning is this COVID cliff and the COVID slide. And we're discussing it at virtually all levels of education. For example, in higher education, we're definitely seeing it with the kind of learning skills students are coming into first and second year university, the kind of writing skills, the kind of test writing skills, and dare I say, even the mathematical skills they're coming with, entering sort of those required courses in the STEM disciplines. So Daniel, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about your understanding of learning loss and what you've heard in terms of your area or related areas.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think when we think about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on learning, I think the most important result is that the effects were deeply unequal. That's, all the empirical literature suggests that. So there's one really fantastic paper by Per Enskell and colleagues published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which was conducted in the Netherlands, who do almost testing every half a year, I think, of students. They have lots of pre-COVID, lots of post-COVID, not post-COVID, but middle of COVID, and then now data. And, you know, the Netherlands is a highly equitable education system. All students had access to laptops. Nevertheless, you see that learning losses disproportionately affected those children who grew up in families with relatively lower income levels. So you can just imagine how this socioeconomic gradient is pervasive and is much worse in countries that have less equitable education systems. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we see is the huge inequities that COVID created when it comes to access to technologies. I mean, teachers tried their best, but also teachers were, of course, hugely affected by this. We mustn't forget that either. I think that, you know, lots of educators are back in the classroom now, but they themselves carry the scars of the pandemic too. So I think that's, for me, the biggest take home is that some, you know, we've conducted some surveys with teachers, and a small proportion, but something like 8% of teachers actually indicated that some of their students had improved during the pandemic. And guess where those students came from? High SES backgrounds, because parents were able to hire private tutors and have teachers come to their house. But this was definitely not true for low-income families. So I think there's a lot of work we have to do to close those gaps anyway in education, but I think that's no more truer than it is today, that these inequities really do exist, and we have a lot of work to do there, I think. And I think finally, I don't want to go on too long, but I think we really need to learn the lessons from this pandemic about how we can mount, you know, remote instruction more effectively in the future. And I think, unfortunately, I have the feeling that it will just get forgotten and we'll just return to where we were. But I think that should be a priority as well. Like, and how can we do so in an equitable way?
Well, it'll be very interesting to see on the remote learning, virtual learning. Prior to the pandemic, for example, Danielle, in Canada, only about 15% of our programming in higher education was offered remotely or by virtual learning. And it'll be the thought initially was that the pandemic was going to create such a huge shift in paradigms for us, that we were going to have such larger percentages of online learning. But if you take Western University as an example, I always thought that was an overambitious projection. About 80% of our programming went back to face-to-face. So although I thought that the sector itself would see maybe an insignificant shift, maybe to 20%, I didn't think we would see the shift that was being predicted. Quite simply because what COVID also taught us is the importance of being together, and the importance of face-to-face learning, and the importance of that learning, particularly, as you just identified, to lower income families. And so there's an equity issue that's related to face-to-face learning as well. So I appreciate your answer. So thank you very much. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and it's related to what Daniel was just speaking about. Marguerite, you focused on lower income, and Daniel just shared with us that lower income were disproportionately represented in learning loss. What makes this a focus area? What have you seen that has made this a particular area in the counseling side of our research and thinking about society post-COVID, that we know we need to focus on this particular population?
For sure. Thanks so much, Donna. I mean, it's been alluded to sort of across all the panelists. When it comes to counseling in particular, we know that our low-income clients aren't accessing services with the same in the same timeframes. They're waiting longer. We also know that when they do receive services, there are higher attrition rates. They're not feeling like their needs are being met in the context of counseling as well. We know that their experiences are also structural. We know that there's tons of mythology and implicit bias that comes when we're speaking about low income and poverty more generally. And we know that this impacts clients and low income families that we work with, both, again, structurally and individually. So I think the piece about the research that Jason, Melissa, and I are going to be doing that I'm most excited about is actually speaking with clients themselves about their experiences and better understanding both what gets in the way of access, but when they are receiving services, what's actually helpful, what's actually helpful in the context of those services. And I think that I think it's something that we need to really be looking at if we're going to be thinking about services that are meeting the needs of folks that we're working with.
So Marguerite, we did have a question. We did have a comment for you from the guests that are here this evening from Debbie. She said, thanks for all these presentations. I'm an OCT, Ontario Certified Teacher, taught 5 years, then transitioned to the field of psychotherapy. I'm currently a registered psychotherapist practicing in Kitchener. I was excited to attend the panels tonight because of seeing the panelists in counseling psychology was represented, Dr. Lingel. I'll look for your research through the CCPA. My wondering tonight is about the B.Ed programs. How are they preparing teachers to understand mental health concerns in schools?
Kathy, shall I leave that to you?
I posted a response, and I can answer that if you're more comfortable, Marguerite, because I know you're fairly new. But for those of you who didn't read the response, we're actually the first university Bachelor of Education program in Canada to offer a mandatory mental health literacy class. We did research, by we, I mean Dr. Susan Roger, myself and colleagues from across Canada worked on just a sort of environmental scan of sorts to say what's going on, where are faculties of education, including research or practice on mental health, and how is it being taken up? Is it in the physical education curriculum, or where is it happening? We found very little of it. So we created a course initially that we were offering to our own students. It's a fabulous course, and those of you who are educators will probably be quite interested to note that it introduces and pairs the students in the class with children who come into their class with a variety of adverse childhood experiences, or are living in current experiences that are most challenging for them. And the information is shared with the students just as it would be in a class. So you might get information about the student that you're working on, the pseudonym and student that's mocked up in the course. So information might come from grandma dropping the child off that day, who happens to mention that dad's getting out of jail on Monday. Or information from someone from social services who comes in to explain that the children are in a different living situation. And it's just a beautiful course, and that course has been offered to any teacher who wants to take it for free. We partnered with UBC, for example, and any teacher who's already practicing, if they didn't go through our program, can take it. But we also had a project where we developed materials and resources and curated them with teachers and invited them to say what would be helpful to you. And I've posted a link to that as well. It's teachresiliency, I think, .ca. And that was done in partnership with PHE Canada. And all of the resources that are included in there are things that have been evaluated by graduate students in the psychology program to make sure that they have efficacy, and that they're useful. And we've also included podcasts and tip sheets and videos of experienced teachers talking about experiences that they've had and how they've dealt with them. And then the one last thing that I'd like to mention is that a change in the way that the teacher education program runs includes something called an alternative field experience, which allows teacher candidates to go into their communities and work with places like Minds Up, or community organizations that focus on children's aid societies, or focus on the social aspects of children's lives. And that is something that contributes toward their learning and broadens it so it's not just what's happening in the classroom. And all students spend as much time doing that as they do in practica, so almost. So that's a number of things that have changed.
So we've come to the end of our time together, and I wanted to first just share about the question and answer chat. I want to thank Dr. Kathy Hibbert. My name shows up as responding because we're both logged in as me, but it has been Dr. Kathy Hibbert who's been responding because I've been moderating.
Gotcha.
So thank you very much, Kathy. I wanted to take an opportunity to thank each of my colleagues for presenting this evening. I started by saying that I'm the proud dean of this Faculty of Education, but I'm very grateful, deeply grateful for the great faculty and great colleagues that I have. And so I really appreciate you taking your time this evening to come and share with our community and to open our homecoming event. So thank you to each of you. I wanted to thank Rosie, Kristen, and Natalie for coordinating and for organizing tonight's event. And I wanted to thank all of our guests who've made the time to come and to learn and to hear about the kind of things that we're doing at the Faculty of Education, the kind of things that we're thinking about. A few things to share. I shared that we have a new strategic plan. I would encourage you, if you're interested in seeing where we are located and how we're thinking about things, to visit the strategic plan. There's a couple of really unique things. We're the first Faculty of Education in Canada to connect to the UN sustainability goals. We also have included, we're the only Faculty of Education in Canada that has the value of kindness as being important to us. I would also invite you to consider supporting the Faculty of Education. So much of what we do depends on the kind of donations we receive from our community members, from our alumni, from donors, and we're deeply grateful for the work that we're able to do when we are able to fundraise. This past year, the faculty, we have put in $3 million of our own funds and funds to support particularly Indigenous students and students with disabilities to be able to come and learn. So do consider supporting, and I've indicated Rosie's email there if you're interested in reaching out to her. I also mentioned that it's our 150th. That's Western's 150th. We are 50 years old, and in a couple of years, and we really want to hear your stories. And so if you are interested in sharing your story and letting us tell your story about what you did with your degree from our Faculty of Education and how it's transformed education and transforming lives, please do consider emailing me. I've put it down on the slide, and do consider sharing your story. We would be honored and pleased to do that, to hear from you, or if you have any ideas about our 50th anniversary, please do reach out. So without further ado, I will wish everybody a good evening. And again, my sincerest thanks to each of you for attending, for speaking, for organizing, and for caring enough about education to be here tonight. So thank you, everyone.